I've gone over that morning so many times in my mind it feels like a worn-out record. Not because I'm proud of how the day kicked off, but because that first sound, the one that triggered everything, still creeps under my skin. It was this light, brittle thump, something small bouncing off metal somewhere in the alley behind the old gas station. A noise too soft to scream danger, but desperate enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. And if you've ever felt that little pull in your gut telling you the world just tilted sideways, you'll get why I stopped walking right there. Why what happened afterward still feels like fate leaned over and whispered my name. And hey, if you're the type who believes in looking out for folks who can't stand up for themselves, literally or figuratively, do me a favor, like the video and hit subscribe. Stories like this don't mean a damn thing unless somebody hears them. And this one? It's heavier than cold steel and louder than a storm rolling over the desert. And it all starts with a kid who should have never had to cry the way he did. I was on my way to the scrapyard, holding an old thermos filled with burnt coffee in one hand and a rusted wrench in the other, when I heard that soft hollow tap again. It sounded like someone too weak to call for help was knocking against a dumpster. My first thought? Probably just a stray cat or some teenager screwing around back there. But when I rounded the corner, I froze. There he was, small, thin enough you could have mistaken him for a shadow, sitting in a beat-up wheelchair. One of the wheels was twisted inward like a promise someone never planned on keeping. His little chest rose and fell in these shaky, uneven breaths, like each inhale was a decision he wasn't sure he could keep making. I would learn later that his name was Caleb, but right then he was just a scared kid with tear tracks carving clean lines through the dirt on his face. He flinched the second his eyes met mine, his hands curling in tight, the way someone does when they've learned to expect nothing but pain. And that single movement told me more about his life than any introduction ever could. "It's all right, kid," I said softly, keeping my voice steady and low. The kind of tone you use with a spooked stray that's been kicked too many times. "You're safe." He didn't speak at first. He just pointed at his stomach, then at the big dark bruise spreading across his arm. And then he whispered, so faint the wind nearly stole the words away, "She didn't feed me again, and she hits me when I cry." Those words snapped something inside me. Not loud anger, not the kind that shouts. No, it was a cold, sharp kind of fury that settles deep and waits. I knelt down beside him, taking in every detail. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to the ghost of a thinner kid. His lips were dry and cracked. His fingers trembled even when he tried to hide it. I asked where his mama was, and he shrugged, eyes flicking toward the rundown apartments behind the station. "She's sleeping," he said. But the crack in his voice told me he wasn't talking about rest. He meant something darker, something that left a boy wheeling himself into an alley just to breathe without fear. I wanted to scoop him up and march straight to the hospital, the cops, anybody who'd listen. But I'd been in this town long enough to know better. The system didn't catch kids like him. It barely even saw them. Folks shut their doors and hoped someone else would care. So I did the only thing that made sense. I sat down beside him and let him talk. He told me about nights without meals, about the screaming, about a man who came around sometimes and made everything worse, about how he learned to go quiet, to hide, to disappear inside himself until the storm died down. He cried when he said he didn't know if his legs were ever going to work again, like even that somehow felt like his fault. Right there, in that cramped alley that smelled like rusted metal and spilled oil, I made a choice. I didn't know what it would cost me, or how far it would take us, but I knew one thing for certain. This boy wasn't going to face any of it alone. I handed him half my sandwich, and he swallowed it so fast it was like he expected me to snatch it back. And man, That hit harder than I expected. I asked if there was anyone he trusted, a neighbor, a friend, anybody he could go to. He shook his head with this deadened look you usually only see in folks 3 times his age. "No one comes," he whispered. "Nobody hears me." Maybe that was the moment it all clicked. Why I heard that sound, why I stopped, why fate shoved me into that alley. Somebody needed to hear him. Somebody had to make enough noise to drown out the silence swallowing him whole. So, while he finished eating, I stepped aside, pulled out my phone, and made a call I hadn't made in years. Not because I was afraid of the man on the other end, but because when his people show up, they don't ease in quietly. "Ghost?" a familiar voice said when he picked up. "You still breathing?" "Barely," I answered, glancing at Caleb as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I got a situation. A kid? Bad one?" The engine rumble on the other end grew loud, and for a second the line went still. Then he said, "Then you need us." I didn't hesitate. "Yeah," I told him, "I need the family." "Hold tight," he said. "We're coming." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my heart pounding with the weight of everything I'd just set in motion. Caleb looked up at me, confused but hopeful, like he wanted to believe something good was finally on its way, but didn't have the strength to trust it yet. I knelt beside him again and whispered, "You're not alone anymore, kid."
"Not today," I muttered, more to myself than to him. And somewhere far off, so distant I almost convinced myself I imagined it, a single motorcycle coughed to life. Then another. Then another. One by one, the engines stacked together until the whole sound thickened, rolling toward us like a storm front that wasn't bringing destruction, but justice. Caleb didn't understand what that rumble meant yet, but I did. Help was on the way. And when the Hell's Angels decide to roar, every soul in this town knows better than to pretend they didn't hear it. The engines grew louder with each heartbeat, tearing through the quiet morning like thunder chewing up the sky. I watched Caleb's eyes widen as he felt the vibrations through the footrests of his wheelchair, like the whole earth finally decided to stand up for him. Truth be told, I hadn't heard that many bikes running together since the memorial ride 5 years back. The sound, the heat, the synchronized heartbeat of all those engines sent a jolt down my spine like someone plugged me straight into a power line. We stepped out of the alley, and I pushed his chair to the curb so he'd get a clear view. A moment like this shouldn't be hidden behind a damn dumpster. It needed to be witnessed. The first bike showed up at the far end of the street, sunlight dancing off the chrome, then another behind it, then another, until a long line of black leather, steel, and polished metal stretched farther than I could track. They rode in perfect formation, not like separate pieces, but like one living creature made of loyalty, road dust, and scars. Doors creaked open up and down the block. Faces appeared in windows. One old man stopped in the middle of raking his yard, jaw swinging loose as the convoy rolled in. When the lead rider, Reverend, pulled right up in front of us, he killed his engine with a slow, solid click that felt like the end of a sentence. The others followed suit, shutting their bikes down one at a time until the whole street fell into this heavy, waiting silence that pressed against my ribs. I knelt beside Caleb again. The boy was trembling, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was that lost feeling of not knowing what to feel at all. I leaned close and whispered, "They're here for you, buddy." He blinked at me, confused, just as Reverend swung his leg over his bike and approached us with that steady, unhurried stride of a man who's lived through enough fire to make fear bow down to him. His beard, braided and long, brushed against his vest. The leather he wore was old and heavy with patches that told stories nobody could understand unless they had lived the miles themselves. But his eyes were soft in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "This the kid?" Reverend asked without breaking eye contact with me, though his voice was loud enough for Caleb to hear every syllable. I nodded. "Yeah, this is Caleb." Reverend lowered himself onto one knee until he was eye level with the boy. He moved with a gentleness that caught me off guard. "Hey, little man," he said, voice warm but steady, the kind of tone built from years of talking people off ledges. "I hear things have been real rough for you." Caleb's shoulders hunched, and he looked down at his hands like he was ashamed of something. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The way Reverend's jaw tightened told me that tiny apology cut him deeper than any insult ever could. "Don't you dare apologize," Reverend said, firm but calm. "Somebody should have stepped in a long time ago. That wasn't on you." He stood up, turned toward the men behind him, and simply said, "We're moving." That was all they needed. No shouting, no chaos, just purpose. The angels spread out with silent, practiced precision, surrounding the apartment building like they'd rehearsed this rescue on a stage 100 times. I lifted Caleb's wheelchair slightly, but Reverend reached for the handles himself. He pushed the boy forward with a kind of respectful seriousness you'd expect when escorting a king. Caleb didn't know where we were going. Hell, neither did I. But when Reverend bent down and asked, "Do you trust me?" and Caleb answered, "Yes," in that small, shaky voice, I knew the world was about to shift under all of us. We rolled toward the apartment building, the air thick enough to taste. And when Reverend kicked the door open, not angrily, just with the steady authority of a man who will not be ignored, the dim hallway inside seemed to fold in on itself. Renee lurched off the couch, hair tangled, eyes foggy, panic twisting her face the second she saw the lineup of leather-clad giants piling in behind us. "What? Who? What are you doing in my house?" she shrieked, clutching the back of the couch like she might barricade herself with it. Reverend didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "We're here for the boy," he said. "Move." She spat out excuses, curses, lies so sour you could practically smell them. Then she lunged toward Caleb, but Chains, a man built like a garage lift, stepped between them without saying a word. She stopped like she'd run face first into a steel beam. Then Troy stumbled out of the bedroom, half his shirt buttoned, stinking of whiskey and stale smoke. He blinked at us with the dull confusion of livestock. "What the hell is this?" he slurred, looking around like he genuinely thought he had control of the situation. Reverend turned toward him slowly and stepped aside just enough to let Troy puff himself up. Troy took one wobbly step forward, trying to bluff courage he didn't have. But Snake, quiet, fast, and cold as January, tapped Troy on the shoulder. And when Troy spun around, he found himself staring into a face that looked like it was carved out of stone and bad intentions. Troy folded faster than a cheap lawn chair. He backed right into the wall with both hands up, voice going thin and squeaky. "I didn't do anything." Reverend didn't even slow down. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You didn't do a damn thing to help him. Not one." He pushed Caleb's wheelchair past both adults, who stood there shaking, caught between fear and pathetic excuses. And I watched Caleb's eyes drop to the floor, his shoulders quivering like every inch deeper into that apartment meant waking something ugly all over again. When we reached the kitchen, the truth smacked us in the face. Cabinets empty. Fridge holding nothing but mustard, expired milk, and despair. Grease cooked so thick on the stove, it looked like it had survived a prehistoric era. A sour, rotting smell curled up the back of my throat. Caleb didn't look. He didn't have to. He already knew. Reverend's jaw tightened until I thought it might snap. "Get him out," he said. I scooped Caleb into my arms, holding him close, and we moved together toward the doorway, like a single unit. Behind us, Renee screeched threats about calling the police, until one of the riders replied calmly, "Go ahead. Tell them why a 9-year-old had to roll himself into an alley just to get something to eat." That shut her down fast. Outside, the street looked different now, brighter, somehow bigger, like the world had stretched just enough to let hope breathe again. Reverend rested a hand on my shoulder. "We take him to the safe house first." I glanced down and caught the way Caleb looked up at him, cautious, hesitant, but with this tiny spark of belief. And as the angels formed around us, engines firing up in a synchronized growl that shook the last bit of darkness off that miserable apartment, one thing hit me square in the chest. This wasn't a rescue anymore. This was the start of a war for a boy who'd been abandoned long before we walked through that door. And the Hell's Angels don't lose wars. I didn't know what to expect when we reached the safe house, But it sure as hell wasn't the warmth that met us when the steel door rolled up and the dim lights flickered on like the place had been waiting for us. It didn't look anything like the movies painted. No chaos, no smoke, no danger. Instead, it was a converted garage filled with clean cots, shelves stocked like a storm shelter, medical supplies organized in neat rows, patched leather vests hanging on hooks, and the faint smell of coffee brewing, as if someone already knew we'd arrive carrying a story heavy enough to need it. Reverend pushed Caleb inside gently, and the kid's eyes darted around, unsure if this was safety or just another place where he needed to make himself small. But the truth settled in, slow. When Bruises, the old mechanic with hands permanently stained by grease and a beard that could hide tools, crouched beside him and offered a warm biscuit. When Mama Joe, widow to a fallen biker and the heart of the club, draped a soft blanket over his shoulders without asking a single question. When Bandit, our medic, knelt beside him and checked his bruises with gentle hands and a voice that apologized every time Caleb flinched. Something shifted. He didn't speak, but his shoulders loosened, his breath evened out. Watching it felt like witnessing winter step aside for spring. While they took care of him, Reverend pulled me aside. His voice slipped into that low, gravelly tone he only used when a person's life hung on the line. We can't send him back. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a question. The memory of that empty fridge and Renee's dead-eyed indifference burned too hot behind both our eyelids. We won't, I said. He nodded once, hard. Good. The decision settled between us like a piece of iron dropped onto the ground, heavy, final, unbreakable. They got one of the guys to call a friendly officer, a man who owed the club enough favors to pick up the phone on the first ring. And within the hour, the safe house was buzzing with quiet, controlled chaos. Forms being filled out, statements drafted, photos taken of bruises Caleb should have never had. But Caleb wasn't thinking about any of that. When I walked back into the main room, he was sitting on a cot, blanket wrapped around him, watching Mama Joe slice apples into perfect little crescent shapes. "Can I really stay here?" he asked her in the smallest voice. Like just asking might get him tossed out. She leaned close, brushing a gentle hand through his hair. "Baby," she said softly, "you're safe as long as you want to be." And right then, something inside the boy cracked, in the best possible way. Then I heard a sound that I'll never forget. A soft, breaking kind of cry, not from pain, but from the weight of finally being protected. It wasn't the scared, bracing for impact kind of crying I'd seen from him before. These were the tears of a kid realizing, maybe for the first time in his life, that he didn't have to flinch for the next hit. I eased down beside him, and he leaned against my arm, not fully, just enough to let me know he was reaching out in the only way he could. "You meant it," he whispered, "when you said I wasn't alone." I nodded. "And I'll mean it tomorrow too," I told him. Later, when the officer who worked with the club showed up, his whole expression hardened the moment he saw Caleb's bruises and the reports Reverend handed over. He snapped pictures, took notes, and shook his head like the sight physically hurt to look at. "This is enough for a full neglect and abuse investigation," he said. "She's not getting him back." It wasn't instant justice, not the dramatic, movie kind, but it was the kind that holds, the kind people like Troy don't slither out of. When the officer left with a promise to call us soon, Reverend turned to me with that stern, unspoken certainty he carried like armor. "He needs more than a safe house," he said. "He needs a home." My chest tightened, because I already knew where he was going with that. My sister, ghost sister to the club, had always been the kind of woman who collected lost things. Stray dogs, abandoned teenagers, broken souls. Her house was a sanctuary disguised as a normal home. She'd been talking for months about wanting to foster again. She had space, she had warmth, she had a goodness even the angels treated like scripture. So, I called her. She picked up on the second ring, and when I laid out everything that had happened, she didn't pause for even a heartbeat. "Bring him," she said, "tonight." When I returned to Caleb with the news, he stared up at me, eyes wide and worried, knuckles white around the blanket. "Will you come too?" he asked quietly. "Will I still see you?" His voice shook, and that small tremor hit harder than a fist ever could. I knelt beside him and set my hand gently on his shoulder. Kid, I said, you're family now, and family doesn't disappear. He let out a long, shaky breath and nodded, trusting me with something delicate and enormous all at once. By the time we loaded him into Reverend's truck, Mama Joe's blanket wrapped around him like armor, the sun had dropped low, turning the sky into a line of molten orange, just barely clinging to the horizon. It felt like the whole world was finally exhaling. The drive to my sister's place was quiet except for Caleb's soft, tentative questions. Would she be kind? Would there be food? Would he have a bed? Questions no kid should ever have to worry about. Each answer I gave seemed to settle him a little more. When we pulled up, my sister opened the door before we even reached the porch. Warm light spilled out behind her like she carried safety in her hands. She knelt in front of him with a smile that was pure kindness, no judgment hiding behind it. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "I'm Lily. I've been waiting for you." And just like that, his world shifted again. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from possibility. We got him inside, let him take his time, let him breathe. He stopped in front of a little bookshelf filled with children's stories, running his fingers over each spine like it was treasure he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. Watching him take it all in, loosen something in my chest, I didn't even realize had been tied up tight for years. When it came time for me to leave, he looked up at me, panic flickering across his face like a candle in the wind. "You'll come back," he whispered. I crouched beside him again and squeezed his shoulder. "There isn't a world big enough to keep me from you, little man." That got me a smile, tired, small, but real. And I knew then that whatever road lay ahead, he finally had a path worth walking. When I got back to the safe house, the angels were waiting outside, engines rumbling softly in the cool night. Reverend raised an eyebrow. "He okay?" I nodded. "He's home." The engines fired up then, not angry this time, victorious. And as the thunder rolled down that quiet street, the truth settled in my bones. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the ones willing to ride straight through hell just to drag you out. And for Caleb, the angels weren't just the men who saved him. They were the men who made sure he would never be alone again.